First of all, many thanks for the invitation to join you all for the second part of this workshop on nature, religion, and ecology. I would have loved to be there for the first one. Unfortunately, that kind of crashed with another online meeting, a faculty meeting in this rather unusual summer term. I'm an ancient historian. I teach at the University of Augsburg, and one of my main interests are basically the environmental humanities and also the place of the ancient world in this new paradigm of interdisciplinary research. And so I was really thrilled to be asked to contribute something along those lines. I think I'm the only scholar who will say something about the ancient Greek religion or ancient Greco-Roman religion. And I think should I share my screen now?
Oh, yes, please do.
Okay, now let's see whether this works. Okay, good. Do you see it or? Yes,
looks very good.
Okay, perfect. Then I think we can head right into this topic that I want to talk about today. I must say that I can hardly do justice to the rich traditions that we have come to associate with the Greco-Roman religion. Rather, I want to take a bit of a different approach and focus on a single writer of the 2nd century of the Common Era, Pausanias, who has traditionally served as one of our main sources for different aspects of ancient Greek religion, but who has not really been used to explore what we may term the ecological aspects of Greek religion so far. In order to tease out some of these ecological aspects of his work, I want to ask somewhat provocatively whether we can see Possanias as a nature writer. But before I begin to talk about his work, some explanations are in order. First, I want to say a few words about some of the central concepts that will feature prominently in the course of this discussion. That is religion, ecology, and nature writing. There are quite a number of studies that have looked at what we may term the environmental aspects of ancient Greek religion. For instance, scholars have revisited ancient Greek mythology from an environmental or ecological vantage point, have looked at the intersection of or interplay of natural landscape features and the Greek religious landscape with its sanctuaries, temples, and oracles, or have used modern concepts like that of the risk society, for example, in order to understand in how far forms of religion and divination have determined the ways the Greeks managed and conceptualized ecological hazards and environmental threats. In environmental history, Greco-Roman religion has long been a focus as well. For instance, the late Donald Hughes has argued that Greco-Roman religion offered one of the powerful discourses and practices of conservation practices and protection of the natural environment in antiquity, an opinion that has found its critics but also gained support in more recent studies. While I will in the following refer to some of these major paradigms and key studies, I choose to go down a somewhat different path. I use one of the key terms of this workshop, namely ecology, in order to illustrate how Greek religion was situated at the intersecting lines between human communities and their natural environments. I thereby follow Ernst Haeckel's original coinage of the term ecology, implying an endeavor to understand the multiple interrelationships between living entities in the whole household of the earth in its varied regions in a manner that does not centralize the human. However, I use the term mainly in the sense of a literary ecology that looks at the stories, what I term the storied ecology, that Pausanias collected in his description of Greece. I want to ask what kind of ecological understanding and knowledge this work entailed, and I want to show how this was connected to religious aspects, especially to the world of Greek myth. Thereby, I take this storied landscape that Pausanias presents not so much as a symbolical realm loaded with archetypal figures, but rather as the concrete narrative manifestation of a highly dynamic material environment. I understand religion as a combination of beliefs, narratives, and practices that's, depending on the situation, involve agents and actions that are in one way or another non-human and superior. This brings us to the third concept or notion, that of nature writing, that has from the 1990s and the rise of eco-criticism onward functioned as the major focus of literary ecology. The term itself is most often associated with a more specific genre of nonfiction prose in English that blends lyricism or other literary qualities with scientific facts or observations of nature, typically also incorporating personal reflection or philosophical interpretation. However, following Carla Armbruster, I want to argue that there is a true benefit in focusing on cultures outside the Anglo-American canon that produced the nature writing tradition. Cultures that potentially offer not only diverse literary traditions, but also different concepts of nature and perspectives on human relationships to the environment. Yet when I speak of Possanias as a nature writer, I do not mean to look for concepts of nature or definitions of physis. There are quite a number of studies that have, in fact, looked at ancient concepts of nature, and I do not have the time to do justice to them here. Rather, I'm interested in the way Pausanias writes about the natural world he encountered on his tours through Greece in his particular mode of literary response. Because whether we call it, as Kate Rigby writes, nature writing, environmental writing, eco-poetics, literary ecology, or something else entirely, the question that remains to be addressed here, and I follow Kate Rigby, is that of the relationship between such writing and the more than human others, places, and histories to which it bids us turn. Rather than thinking of this primarily as a matter of mimesis, however, Rigby suggests that such writing be considered as embodying what she refers to as a literary practice of response. As such, we can truly say that writing is relational in that it can be seen to react to the non-human world, while becoming in turn the locus of a new call to and upon the reader, as Rigby says. Yet, as she also cautions, since writing is inextricably bound up with a specific human communicative context, the particular mode of written response will vary in accordance with a range of cultural, social, situational, and generic contingencies. It is these particular modes of written response, these different types of socio-cultural frameworks and generic contingencies that can be analyzed for different epochs and eras. Only when we do this, I argue, will it become possible to open up the scholarly analysis of so-called nature writing to a study of the pre-modern world. If we reframe the term nature writing and understand it not as the portrayal of an idyllic or pastoral nature with a capital N, but rather when we perceive the practice of writing as, in Rigby's words, a literary practice of response to the non-human or more than human, then it becomes possible to detach our own reading from certain generic expectations. And as I argue, it is by looking at this literary response that we can catch a glimpse of the way in which ancient Greek religion related to the non-human world. How it can, in fact, be seen as a discourse, but also a practice of negotiating what we may term ecology. In order to uncover the literary ecology that I see at work in Pausanias' description of Greece, I want to look at a number of aspects that characterize nature writing in general. When I say nature writing, I refer to writing that has a strong, intricate relationship to its surroundings, not merely a setting, but as an integral part of its innermost fabric. Such writing establishes various connections to the landscapes to which it responds, and thereby calls upon its readers to revalue more than human beings, places, and histories. As I'm about to argue, this is exactly what the description of Greece does. Let's start with Possanias himself. Here is just an idea to give you sort of a map of his tours that he undertook through Greece. I photocopied these maps that sort of give you a first impression. The reason why I choose him as my primary focus in the context of this workshop is because Pausanias was particularly obsessed with classical landscapes of Greece that were in his own time, the heyday of the Roman Empire, seen as ancient in themselves. Pausanias wrote 10 books about Greece that were most likely published in their extant order between 155 and 180 of the Common Era. Although we do not know much about the author himself, we can safely say that he was well-traveled and belonged to the wealthy and well-educated elite of his time. His description of Greece has often been mined for archaeological and mythological information, but the reason why this text lends itself to an ecological reading is because Pausanias is increasingly seen as an author who attached great meaning to the sites he encountered on his tours through Greece. This alone is not enough, however. In general, Possanias is regarded as a writer who was a deeply religious person, and writing about myth, cult, or ritual was for him the primary way of making sense of the natural world around him. The description of Greece puts a special focus on sacred sites and was mainly concerned with places that were historically or culturally relevant or important. As has often been noted, impressive sceneries were hardly mentioned at all, and whenever Pausanias writes about landscape features such as trees, rocks, or wells, he did so because they were connected to certain cults or temples. Since this fragmentary approach to the Greek landscape was inextricably bound up with stories of communities, they naturally had an anthropocentric, highly localized outlook, and they were told because they were, in one way or another, important to the humans who lived in a specific region of Greece. For instance, the Valley of the Styx in northern Arcadia was worth a visit because of its important role in Greek myth as a river of the underworld by which the gods swore their most solemn oaths. Possanias uses a whole chapter to discuss traditions about the Styx, while his comments on the route take up only a few lines. This visit could not be made without considerable effort because the route leads through extremely mountainous territory. But Pausanias does not mention that these few lines describe a tour of at least a day's travel over passes and through narrow valleys which bear little resemblances to a cultivated Mediterranean landscape. In this passage, Pausanias does acknowledge the landscape in its own right, perhaps because it was such an apt setting for the legendary river. Pausanias is someone, to put it anachronistically, who likes to zoom in on a landscape. He's not really interested in impressive panoramic views or postcard images. The same holds true when we look at how he writes about the Isthmus of Corinth. Overlooking surrounding, Pausanias is moved to digress, as it were, from his usual habit of scanning the landscape and reading it for the traces of memory it contains. Sites encountered become texts to be read, while encountered texts are, as Susan Alcock puts it, transformed into landscapes of memory. In this case, Pausanias does not dwell on the natural scenery so much as think about past attempts to dig a channel through landscapes in general, musing about how the attempts that he describes in this passage were futile, and about their implied hubris. His reference to the Cnidians evokes an episode described in the histories of Herodotus, written in the 5th century before the Common Era. So the Periegesis Helados, the description of Greece, can be said to be a literature of response in two ways. Firstly, in that it responds to the sites encountered on Pausanias' tours, sites that then lead to stories. Secondly, the Periegesis Helados can be seen as a literary response to other texts and stories that could be, as the last lines of this quotation show, oral and local in kind. So he mixes textual and communicative memory, or oral memory. This is also a good example of the scales at work in the description of Greece that I referred to at the outset. The text presents us with a deep time of Greek myth and how it relates to natural settings and cult places, offering also highly opinionated commentary that weaves in a discourse about normative behavior, or rather rules of behavior. Every act or sort of behavior that would seem to transcend certain human boundaries is usually harshly criticized by Pausanias. A critique that can also involve the mythological tradition itself. I just show you these quotes that are discussed a lot in the literature. I don't have the time to do justice to them here. I just want to show you that there was also a kind of meta-discourse, a critical meta-discourse about the mythological tradition in the text. We can talk about that later. Referring to the literary techniques and the high degree of selectivity that Pausanias brings to his subject, Jas Elsner has argued that Pausanias turned the landscape of Greece into a rhetorical discourse and, at the same time, as he says, a fantasy. And I quote him, "It consisted of an enchanted past, of living myths and rituals whose apparent antiquity guaranteed their modern meanings. Its nostalgia makes the description of Greece one of the first truly monumental romantic texts And it is not surprising that the periegesis has particularly appealed to Victorian neo-romantics, especially archaeologists and seekers of lost religions, end quote. This is an important observation for our topic at hand because it makes clear that our modern views of the ancient Greek landscape have, to a large degree, been prefigured or predetermined by a text like Pausanias' description of Greece. The periegesis Helados is not just an objective description of Greece, however, so much as it is, as Greta Hals puts it, also a conceptual map of its traditions. It was a way of establishing a set of connections between landscapes and Greek traditions of storytelling, which in themselves illustrate, as Hals puts it, an intricate, integral relationship with their physical surroundings. In recent years, scholars of Greek myth in general have paid more attention to the contextual dynamics which animate the mythic tradition, having come to see storytelling as an activity which is both precisely situated in and contingent on its environment. The description of Greece exemplifies this perfectly. But this alone does not qualify it as a text that invites ecological readings. And it is at this point where I move away from the usual practice of reading Possanias. Since the rediscovery of the description of Greece in the Renaissance, Possanias has not only been read as presenting a kind of topographical representation of the country, but as, in a sense, presenting a timeless account of it. As Alcock has noted, the various events Pausanias chooses for commemoration are often so far distant from each other in terms of their reality and temporality, but they are usually combined by Pausanias with an textual framework that Alcock terms ritual time. In the periegesis Helados, landscapes, events, and stories interact with each other beyond the bounds of any linear historical chronology. So Pausanias is traditionally seen as an author who filters out almost everything in the landscape that would not appeal to an antiquarian sense of Greek identity. As Pausanias himself notes when visiting Olympia, I quote him, "Many are the sights to be seen in Greece, and many are the wonders to be heard. But on nothing does heaven bestow more care than on the Eleusinian rites and the Olympic Games." This focus on the way personal experience of travel, itineraries, histories, and storytelling interact has added in lending the text a somewhat static appearance, and as an archive of sorts that during the imperial era turned into the expression of an antiquarian nostalgia for the past greatness of Greek traditions. In other words, of the romantic sentiment that many scholars see at work in the description of Greece and its reception history alluded to above. And it is a view of the ancient Mediterranean that has had strong and lasting persistence in the cultural memory. It is no wonder that Pausanias is primarily read as an author who was greatly interested in the past greatness and subsequent fall of Greek civilization. While I do not think that such readings miss the point, I do think that alternative readings are possible that can supplement our existing interpretation and that will help in actually resituating the ancient world and its cultures in contemporary environmental debates. So far, my account has been concerned with the conceptual significance of the Greek landscape as a container for stories and memories. But there's another side to the description of Greece that has to do with the dimension of the experience of actually, traveling in landscape, the experiential dimension. Usually, this has been discussed with taking recourse to Pausanias' personal reflections on the mythic traditions that he encountered on his tours and that he negotiated, for instance, with the help of allegorical readings that included the environments he found in a given place. But there's another side to this story. What has often been missed in historical readings of Pausanias is that he was very much interested in the natural history of a region. What caught his attention time and again were the specific hydrological conditions of the regions of Greece, with their rivers, springs, and sources of fresh water. As with other natural landmarks, stories attached to these natural sites were important. Across the Mediterranean world, sources of fresh water were seen as life-giving and usually sacred sites. The presence of water was of utmost importance in a relatively dry climate and featured prominently in Greek religion. Diverse traditions explained the appearance of springs, the courses of rivers, and the connections between such water features, real and imagined. Moreover, watercourses and springs were inextricably connected to regional identities. Pausanias' description of Greece as a whole offers a good testimony to all of these features of how the Greeks related to the hydrological conditions of their mainland. But for Possanias, it seems rivers had, beyond and above such cultural traditions of storytelling, a very material dimension. As befits a work that came from personal travel, rivers, springs, sources of fresh water abound in the description of Greece. Yet no description of them is the same or follows the same rules. As he says, rivers have always been different from each other and are so to this day in the trees and grasses they naturally produce. What is characteristic of descriptions such as these, and it's just a short part here, is that Pausanias often spends a lot of time in describing the specific material characteristics of a river. He describes the water, the way a river flows, its own presence in the landscape, but also the animals and plants that live there. Here's a longer passage, and I could have shown you many, many more, but I have to, of course, make a selection. It is in these passages where Pausanias suddenly enters the text as a corporeal being. He describes the way waters taste, smell, what their colors are, what their temperature is. Thus, he relates the real bodily effects that these waters have. They can either warm a human's body like the hottest drug and cure diseases, or they can be like acid, dissolving lead pipes or other materials like stones or glass. This has the effect that the reader has the impression as if the author were truly immersed in the landscape, in its material realities, rather than storied abstractions, inviting, in fact, what Stacy Alamo refers to as a transcorporeal imagination, where humans and non-humans are connected through material networks. And I feel that it is in these passages where the writing turns into a true response to non-human entities, in fact, agencies that transcend landscapes and bodies and beings. Water, in its essence, is a fluid medium, and what it confronts us with are not so much storied landscapes, but rather landscapes of porosity, where every being is dependent on the life-giving or devastating forces of this element. In passages where Possanias writes about water, he presents his readers with a complex material web composed of water, soil, animals, humans, and land. As Raymond Williams once noted, such writing can be seen as offering the vision of a world of properly materialist history, where there's no room for the separate abstract categories of nature and human. And it is finally in passages such as these that the description of Greece becomes a narrative of matter. If we reread the description of Greece, and indeed any other ancient text, I think, as a narrative of material relationships, we can arrive at a reading practice that opens itself up to the many non or more than human voices to which writing bids us turn, as Rigby said in the quote above. Then it will also become possible to reintegrate the ancient textual tradition in contemporary debates in the environmental humanities, where post-human and material approaches feature so prominently. This is important for two reasons. Firstly, in that it leads to a more inclusive definition of what ancient environments constitute. They are not merely repositories of cultural memories and landscapes that have been overwritten by countless stories, but dynamic testaments to material encounters between humans and non-humans. Secondly, in that it leads to a reconceptualization of the apparent anthropocentrism of Greco-Roman culture and the Western tradition in general. In its response to the more than human world of material relations, a text like Pausanias' description of Greece constantly grapples with what it means to be a human among a vast assemblage of agencies and bodily presences, giving way to a transcorporeal, even post-human outlook at times, that finds increasing scholarly attention amongst ancient scholars. That my notion of the landscapes of porosity that Pausanias presents is not just a mere metaphor in this regard, becomes clear when we turn our attention back at the text itself. In his description of Lake Stymphalos in Arcadia, Pausanias provides a prolonged discussion of the specific material conditions that determine the specific geomorphological environment of the region. It is characterized by limestone and karst, and one specificity of the immediate surroundings of the lake was that water drained off through holes, fissures, and chasms in the ground. Thus, Possanias writes, the river Stymphalus issues from the lake and descends into a chasm in the earth, and reappearing once more in Argolis, it changes its name and is called Erasinus instead of Stymphalus. As has recently been argued, such accounts emerged from the observation of the very common natural phenomenon of subterranean rivers in Greece. An observation that certainly contributed to the elaboration of imaginations of the underworld as a wet place. This is hardly an account of a static cultural archive telling of great civilizations of the past, however, but rather the expression of a highly dynamic, fluid environment in which culture and nature were inextricably intertwined in material networks. What we are confronted with in Pausanias' account of this particular region of Greece is a porous landscape in the true sense of the word. It allows us to see the fabrics of human nature interaction that were at the heart of the mythological stories that Pausanias tells at other instances, for example, when he talks about Heracles' fight against the Stymphalian birds, or the many cult locations situated near the lake and dedicated to river gods. So, to come to a conclusion, in my reading, the description of Greece is a testament to landscapes of porosity, where narratives of matter can complement and add to the cultural narratives that we find in the text. If we understand the text as a literature of response, we are confronted with new understandings of ancient environments, moving beyond romanticized notions of Mediterranean landscapes and the civilizing discourses inherent in the classical tradition. They turn a static and monumental archive of cultural memory into a dynamic and open imaginative space that allows us to analyze how ancient environments and their textual and material narratives have shaped time and again our understanding of humanity's place in the world. So, can we call Pausanias a nature writer? Yes, that is, if we move away from dichotomized discourses of nature writing to a literary ecology of response, where writing is taken seriously as a negotiation of material. In fact, I think this is a good way to frame our conception and understanding of the mythic stories that make up the backbone of the Perigesis Hellados and of Greek religion in general. In my literary ecological reading, myth is a negotiation of material terrains. I thank you a lot for your attention.